On a snowy December night, a hungry little girl stole a single Christmas cookie for her sick mother, never imagining that her desperate act would catch the attention of a billionaire who would turn their world upside down. The cafe winter glow glimmered like a warm oasis in the middle of a cold December evening, its windows fogged from the contrast between winter air and the heat of freshly baked pastries inside. People hurried in and out, clutching paper cups of hot chocolate, their laughter blending with the soft sound of holiday music. The smell of cinnamon, nutmeg, and vanilla drifted onto the street like an invitation, one that promised comfort, sweetness, and the illusion that the world was kinder during the holidays. Near the doorway, barely noticeable among the bustling adults, stood a little girl named Lily Hunter. Her yellow dress peeked out from under a too-thin coat, and her bright red scarf wrapped around her small neck stood out like a tiny flame in the wintry dusk. She held herself with a strange mix of bravery and fragility, shifting her weight nervously as customers passed her without a second glance. In her hand, grasped so carefully it was as if she feared it might crumble, was a small Christmas cookie, just one, neatly wrapped in a napkin she'd taken from a counter when no one was looking. Lily wasn't trying to hide it out of guilt. She wasn't a thief and knew full well that taking things without paying was wrong. But the cookie wasn't for her. It was for her mother, who lay in a hospital bed several blocks away, growing weaker each day. Her mother hadn't tasted anything sweet in weeks, and Lily wanted, more than anything, to give her something that felt like Christmas, something that reminded her she was still loved, still cared for, still part of the world outside those white, sterile walls. Just as Lily turned to leave, hoping to slip away unnoticed, a sharp voice cut through the holiday music. "Hey! You there! What do you think you're doing?" The rude security guard shoved past a couple stepping inside and marched toward Lily with the heavy steps of someone who enjoyed having power over people smaller than himself. His eyes narrowed at the little cookie in her hand as if she were hiding a treasure worth thousands instead of a single piece of decorated dough. Lily froze, gripping the napkin tighter. I took a little Christmas cookie for my mom," she whispered, her voice trembling as much as her fingers. "She's in the hospital." But the guard didn't care. His expression twisted with irritation, and he grabbed her arm in a rough, unnecessary gesture. "This isn't a shelter for beggars," he snapped. "Stealing is stealing. Get out before I—" He didn't finish the sentence. A calm, authoritative voice cut him off, a voice that made several customers turn their heads instinctively. "Let go of the girl. Now." The guard's hand loosened immediately as he turned to see who had spoken. Standing a few feet away was a man who looked as though he had stepped straight out of a business magazine cover. His tailored light blue suit contrasted sharply with the soft glow of the cafe lights, and his brown hair was neatly styled despite the light snowfall outside. His blue eyes were sharp, focused, and currently fixed on the guard with a quiet, controlled anger that needed no explanation. It was Andrew Colton, the millionaire owner of the cafe chain. Lily blinked, unsure whether she should stay or run. Andrew, however, ignored the guard's stammering excuses and approached her slowly, lowering himself to one knee so he wouldn't tower over her. "You're all right," he said in a much gentler tone, noticing the fear in her eyes. "You're safe now." Lily nodded, though a tear slipped down her cheek despite her trying to hold it in. She looked so small and lost, clutching the cookie with the determination of someone far older than her years. Andrew glanced at the guard. "You're fired," he said simply. "No shouting. No theatrics. Just cold finality." The guard sputtered, but Andrew didn't give him a second look. Instead, he turned back to Lily. "Why were you taking the cookie?" he asked softly, not accusingly. Lily swallowed hard and lifted her eyes, which were impossibly blue and impossibly sad. "I just wanted to bring something sweet to my mommy," she murmured. "She's in the hospital, and we don't have money for things like this anymore." Her voice cracked, and Andrew felt something inside him shift. The girl standing before him wasn't just frightened, she was fighting for something, or someone, in a way a child her age never should have to. The noise of the cafe seemed to fade into the background as Andrew realized that this single moment, this little girl, this little cookie, this injustice, was about to change far more than anyone present could imagine. Andrew remained kneeling beside Lily for a long moment, letting the warmth of the cafe settle around them while she struggled to hold herself together. The customers nearby pretended not to stare, though several watched with the kind of guilty curiosity people reserve for moments that felt too intimate to intrude upon yet too compelling to ignore. The little girl wiped her cheek with the edge of her red scarf, embarrassed that she had cried in front of a stranger, especially one who looked so important. Her fingers trembled as she adjusted the napkin around the cookie, as if protecting the fragile shape might give her courage. "I didn't mean to make trouble," she whispered, afraid he might think she had caused a scene on purpose. "I just wanted Mommy to have something sweet. She always loved Christmas cookies." Andrew didn't smile, but something softened in his expression, the hard lines around his jaw easing as he listened. He recognized the tone in her voice, the kind that carried both apology and desperation, the kind that children used when they feared that even their small wishes were a burden. He knew it because he had used it once himself, in a hospital hallway not unlike the one her mother was lying in now. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said quietly, making sure she heard every word. "There's nothing wrong with wanting to make your mother happy." Lily lifted her eyes again, hesitant but hopeful. She seemed to be studying him, trying to understand why someone like him, someone dressed in a suit that probably cost more than everything she and her mother owned, would bother speaking to her at all. Her gaze lingered on his face, his eyes, the calm authority with which he carried himself. Something about him reminded her of the father she saw in holiday commercials, steady, strong, always knowing what to do. But Andrew noticed something else about her that tugged at him unexpectedly. Beneath her bravery was exhaustion. He recognized it in the way her shoulders slumped, in the shadows beneath her eyes, in the forced cheerfulness she tried to put on like armor. This wasn't just a child who missed her mother, this was a child who had been carrying far too much alone. "Lily," he said gently, testing her name as if it were something precious, "why are you out here by yourself? Did someone bring you?" She looked down at her boots, scuffed and speckled with melting snow. "I came after school," she murmured. "I walk here. It's not far. Mommy always told me not to go alone, but she can't come with me anymore." She paused, sucking in a shaky breath. "The nurses let me visit before bedtime, so I wanted to bring her something nice. Just a cookie." Her explanation was simple, but the impact of it struck Andrew like a blow. A child her age shouldn't be navigating the city alone. She shouldn't be rationing coins, worrying about whether she had enough for a tiny treat, or dealing with guards who treated her like a criminal. She should have been choosing ornaments for a Christmas tree, asking for new books or toys, laughing with her friends, things she no longer seemed to believe she had a right to. "And your mother?" he asked softly. "How long has she been in the hospital?" Lily hesitated, as though saying it out loud made it more real. "A few weeks," she whispered, curling her shoulders inward. "She got sick all of a sudden. First she was tired a lot, then she couldn't walk, and then she fainted at home. The doctors said she needs special medicine and help that we can't pay for." Her voice thinned to a fragile thread. "I'm trying to be good so she doesn't worry." Andrew exhaled slowly, feeling his resolve solidify. He had approached her simply because he couldn't tolerate cruelty, but now the situation was revealing itself to be something far larger, something painful and familiar. He saw in Lily the echo of a boy he once was, helpless, frightened, and wholly unprepared to face the brutal realities of illness and financial desperation. The memory of his own mother lying weak in a hospital bed flashed sharply in his mind, bringing with it the same sense of helplessness he had sworn never to feel again. He reached out slowly, not to touch her but to offer reassurance in the space between them. "Lily," he said, his voice firm yet gentle, "you shouldn't have to handle this alone. Your mother wouldn't want you to." She bit her lip, fresh tears filling her eyes. I know, but if I don't help, who will? The simplicity of her question, and the heartbreaking truth inside it, made Andrew's chest tighten. It wasn't fair. Children weren't supposed to be responsible for easing adult burdens. They certainly weren't supposed to walk through winter streets hoping to steal moments of joy for a sick parent. Before he could respond, her small stomach growled quietly, the sound almost lost in the buzz of the cafe. She stiffened, clearly embarrassed. Andrew pretended not to notice the flush of her cheeks, but his decision was already forming with unmistakable clarity. Come with me, he said softly. Let's get you something warm to eat. And after that, we'll go see your mother together. Lily stared at him in shock, her eyes widening as if he had offered her the moon. Really? She whispered. Really, he replied. And in that moment, the world around them, full of rushing strangers and holiday glitter, seemed to pause, as if acknowledging that something extraordinary had just begun in the most unexpected place. Andrew drove through the city with a speed that felt natural to him but had Lily clutching the seat quietly, her eyes wide as she watched the world blur past the window. She sat bundled in her red scarf, legs dangling above the floor of the luxury car, and although she tried to appear calm, her fingers twisted nervously in the fabric of her coat. The cookie, now safely tucked into a small paper bag Andrew had given her, rested on her lap like something sacred. He glanced at her a few times, taking in the way she held her breath whenever they passed flashing lights or sirens, and wondered how long she had been living with this constant sense of uncertainty. The city outside sparkled with festive decorations, twinkling lights, garlands, dancing snowflakes, yet to Lily it all seemed muted, distant, as though she could only admire joy from behind an invisible wall. When they finally arrived at the hospital, the automatic doors slid open with a faint whoosh, releasing the sterile scent of disinfectant that instantly replaced the warm fragrances of the cafe. Lily stepped through the entrance with practiced familiarity. She didn't look around like a child entering a new place, she walked straight ahead as someone who knew the corridors too well. The contrast made Andrew's chest tighten. No child should navigate a hospital with such certainty. She led him through hallways decorated with faded holiday drawings made by patients, past nurses pushing equipment carts, past parents sitting sleepless beside vending machines. Andrew felt an ache of recognition. He had walked these same types of halls decades ago, feeling small and powerless while adults whispered diagnoses he didn't understand. Lily stopped in front of a pale blue door and hesitated for the first time since they arrived. Her hand hovered over the handle, trembling slightly. She might be sleeping, she said softly. She gets tired very fast. The fear behind her eyes told Andrew that what she really meant was, she might be worse. He nodded, silently promising himself he wouldn't let this child face that fear alone. Inside, the room was dimly lit, with machines quietly blinking in steady rhythms. On the bed lay Madison Hunter, her brown hair fanned across the pillow, her skin far too pale for someone in her 30s. Even from a distance, Andrew could see the weight loss, the exhaustion, the shadows beneath her eyes. She looked like a woman carrying the full burden of illness and responsibility on her frail shoulders. Yet when she heard the sound of the door, she tried to sit up, instinctively attempting to gather whatever strength she had left. Lily? Her voice cracked, raspy from fatigue. Sweetheart, I didn't know you were coming this late. Who did you bring with you? Lily hurried to her mother's bedside and carefully laid the cookie bag on the nightstand, her face radiant with pride despite the heaviness in the room. Mommy, I brought you something. A Christmas cookie. And this is Andrew. He helped me. Madison's tired eyes flicked to Andrew, confusion crossing her features. She looked embarrassed that her daughter had needed help, embarrassed that a stranger saw her in such a vulnerable state, embarrassed by circumstances she never chose. She tried to straighten her blanket, as if tidying her appearance could hide the reality of her situation. I'm so sorry, she said quietly. I don't know what happened. Lily shouldn't bother anyone. She's just trying to do something nice. Andrew stepped closer, his tone steady and warm. She didn't bother me. She's a remarkable girl, and she was only trying to make your evening brighter. The exhaustion in Madison's features deepened as tears filled her eyes. She turned away, ashamed of her own weakness. I wish I could take care of her the way she deserves. Everything fell apart so fast. I used to work as a nurse. I thought I would be helping people this season, not lying here unable to help my own daughter. Her voice broke, and she quickly wiped her cheek, as though she didn't want Lily to see. Lily gripped her mother's hand tightly, shaking her head with the fierce determination of a child who refuses to accept guilt placed on someone they love. You're the best mommy, she whispered. I'm not scared when I see you. I'm only scared when I can't. Andrew felt something twist inside him, a mixture of admiration for the child's strength and anger at the situation that forced her to be so brave. He looked at Madison again, recognizing the quiet despair that lingered behind her gentle smile. He could see the fear in her eyes, fear of bills, fear of losing her health, fear of losing her daughter to the system if she couldn't care for her. Madison, he said carefully, has anyone been helping you with treatment plans or financial options? Her shoulders slumped as she let out a hollow laugh. There's nothing to help with. I lost my insurance when I had to stop working. The medications they want to try, the ones that might actually help, they're far beyond what I could ever afford. At this point I'm just hoping to stay stable long enough to figure something out. But that's not much of a plan, is it? Andrew didn't answer at first. He studied her fragile form, then glanced at Lily, who had placed her head gently against her mother's arm. It struck him how desperately the two clung to each other, not because they were weak, but because they were all the other had. Something inside him clicked into place, as if a door that had been locked for years suddenly swung open. He realized that he hadn't stepped into this hospital room by accident. He was meant to be here. He was meant to hear this story, to witness this bond, to feel this ache in his chest that told him he couldn't simply walk away. And as he stood there, watching Lily quietly unwrap the cookie to place it in her mother's hand, Andrew knew with absolute clarity that the moment he had intervened in that cafe was not the end of the story, it was only the beginning. Andrew barely slept that night. He lay in his penthouse surrounded by glass walls and city lights, yet felt as though he were trapped in a dim hospital room, watching Lily's small hand clutch her mother's. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Madison's exhausted smile, the way she tried to hide her fear behind gratitude, and the spark of stubborn hope in Lily's voice when she insisted everything would be all right. The contrast between his world and theirs was unbearable. His home was warm, luxurious, and silent, theirs was filled with machines, medical bills, and the constant threat of losing everything. It wasn't just unfair, it was infuriating. By morning, he knew he couldn't continue pretending his life was separate from theirs. Something inside him had shifted the moment Lily whispered that she was scared only when she couldn't see her mother. The memory of his own childhood, his mother lying weak in bed while bills piled up, the feeling that help would never come, rose in him like a tide he could no longer push back. At his office, Andrew's staff could immediately tell something was different. He didn't stroll in with his usual calm confidence. He walked fast, brows drawn together, focused with the kind of intensity that meant decisions were already forming in his mind. His assistant hurried behind him, reading off his schedule, meetings, conference calls, a luncheon with city officials, but Andrew didn't slow down. He went straight into his office, closed the door, and opened his laptop, ignoring the stack of reports waiting on his desk. He began searching medical information with the precision of someone trained to solve problems quickly and thoroughly. He reviewed the type of treatment Madison needed, cross-checked success rates, looked into timelines, side effects, and cost breakdowns. The numbers were brutal. Even a well-off middle-class family wouldn't have managed them, much less a single mother who had been living paycheck to paycheck. The cost of the treatment alone was more than what Madison could earn in a year of full-time nursing. And that didn't include the hospital stay, physical therapy, or the medications she would require afterward. Andrew leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. The sickness in his stomach wasn't from the financial figures, it was from knowing that this situation was common. That countless families were trapped in the same hopeless cycle, just waiting for the last piece of stability to give way. He had spent years building a business that prided itself on efficiency and innovation, yet none of that sophistication seemed to matter when faced with something as painfully human as a mother and daughter trying to survive alone. He picked up his phone and called his attorney. "I need you to start the process for private medical sponsorship," Andrew said without preamble. "Full coverage. Immediate authorization." There was a pause before his attorney asked, "May I ask for whom?" "Madison Hunter," Andrew replied. "She's currently admitted at Westbrook Medical Center. I want every expense covered, treatment, medication, follow-up care, anything the doctors deem necessary. No caps, no delays." His attorney hesitated. "This is substantial, Andrew. It isn't a one-time donation. This could be a long-term commitment." "I understand," Andrew said, his voice steady. "Handle whatever paperwork you need. And make sure the hospital is notified today." The attorney agreed, still sounding stunned, and Andrew hung up. But even with that decision made, he felt restless. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, staring at the city far below, people rushing to work, delivery vans weaving through traffic, the world moving on without realizing that a mother and child were clinging to each other in fear just a few miles away. He thought about Lily's bravery, how she walked into a cafe alone to get a single cookie for her mother, how she looked ashamed not because she did something wrong but because she believed she didn't deserve kindness. He remembered how she had asked, "If I don't help, who will?" That question echoed in him more loudly than the noise of the city outside. He had spent years building wealth, influence, and a reputation for being unshakable. But none of it meant anything if he couldn't answer that question when it mattered most. His decision was already made, but the emotional resolve came now, settling deep in his chest. He wasn't helping out of guilt or pity or charity. He was helping because he knew exactly what it felt like to wait for a miracle that never came. He had once needed someone to step in for him, and no one had. He would not allow history to repeat itself for Lily or her mother. A knock sounded on his office door, and his assistant poked her head in. "Sir, the executives for the 10 o'clock meeting are waiting." Andrew turned, his expression composed but distant. "Cancel it." She blinked, stunned. "Cancel? All of it?" "Yes," he said. "Clear my schedule for the rest of the day. But no exceptions." She nodded reluctantly and closed the door, leaving him alone with the weight of his choice. He gathered his coat, straightened his suit, and headed out, not toward a meeting room, but toward his car. Work could wait. Success could wait. The world could wait. But Lily and her mother could not. As he drove back toward the hospital, Andrew felt something rare, purpose that couldn't be measured in profits or accolades. He didn't know how they would react to the news or how this decision would reshape their lives and his own. He only knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was going to change the ending of their story. When Andrew arrived at the hospital later that afternoon, he expected to find the same quiet room, the same weary mother, and the same hopeful little girl. Instead, he stepped into a situation that jolted him with a surge of anger so sharp it nearly stole his breath. Lily stood in the hallway with her back pressed against the wall, her hands balled into tiny fists, and tears streaming down her cheeks. A woman in a gray blazer, stern-faced, clipboard in hand, stood between her and the door to Madison's room. A social worker. The sight made Andrew's entire body tense. "I don't want to go anywhere," Lily cried, her voice cracking. "Please, I don't want to leave my mom." Madison's weak voice could be heard from inside the room, panicked but too faint to rise above the noise. Nurses stood awkwardly nearby, unable to intervene. They exchanged sympathetic glances but remained silent, bound by policy and fear of overstepping. The social worker spoke calmly, almost mechanically, as though she had repeated this speech countless times before. "Lily, I know it's scary, but we have to make sure you're safe. Your mother is very ill and unable to care for you right now. Until proper arrangements can be." "No!" Lily screamed, her small frame trembling violently. "I'm not leaving her." Andrew stepped forward before the social worker could continue, his voice cutting through the chaos with icy precision. "What exactly is happening here?" The woman turned, startled by the sudden presence of a well-dressed man who radiated authority. "Sir, this is a private matter. We received reports that the child is frequently left alone without supervision and that the mother's condition has deteriorated to the point where she cannot provide adequate care. We're assessing the situation for emergency placement." Andrew's jaw tightened. He had dealt with board members, government officials, and billion-dollar negotiations without raising his voice, but right now all he felt was indignation boiling dangerously close to the surface. Lily ran to him the moment she saw him, wrapping her arms around his waist as if he were the only solid thing left in the world. "Please don't let them take me," she sobbed. "I won't leave Mommy. I won't." Andrew placed a steady hand on her back, shielding her with his presence. "No one is taking you anywhere," he said firmly. The social worker tilted her head, unimpressed. "And who exactly are you? A family friend? A neighbor?" Andrew straightened, the cold steel of his business persona sliding into place. "I'm Andrew Colton." Recognition flickered in her eyes, surprise first, then discomfort. "The owner of Westbrook Medical and its associated charity foundation?" "That's correct." She inhaled sharply, suddenly aware that she was no longer speaking to a powerless bystander. But she didn't back down entirely. "Mr. Colton, my duty is to ensure the child's welfare. Living conditions and access to basic needs seem compromised. Her mother cannot currently provide." "Her mother," Andrew interrupted, "is receiving life-saving treatment, which I am personally funding. Effective today, all medical costs, rehabilitation, medication, and follow-up care are covered. Permanently. Additionally, I will be arranging temporary in-home support so that this family does not have to face this alone." The hallway fell silent. The social worker blinked, speechless for the first time since his arrival. Nurses looked at one another, stunned. Lily's grip around his coat tightened. Andrew moved past the woman and opened the door to Madison's room. She was propped up weakly on her pillows, tears streaking down her face as she listened helplessly to the commotion outside. When she saw Lily and Andrew, her breath hitched. "They were going to take her away from me," she whispered, her voice trembling with horror. Andrew stepped inside, gently guiding Lily to her mother's bedside. "That will not happen," he assured her. "Not now. Not ever." The social worker hovered uncertainly at the doorway, torn between procedure and the new reality unfolding before her. Andrew turned to face her again, his expression cool and unmistakably authoritative. "You may update your report to reflect that all concerns about financial instability, lack of supervision, and medical neglect have been resolved. This family has the support they need. And they will remain together." The woman swallowed hard, then finally nodded. "I will need to confirm documentation. My legal team will send everything within the hour." With nothing more to argue, she left the room, her heels clicking quickly down the hallway. The door closed behind her, leaving a heavy, trembling silence in her wake. Madison covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed by relief and humiliation. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted Lily to go through this. I never wanted anyone to see how bad things have gotten." Andrew approached her gently. "You have nothing to apologize for. Illness is not a moral failure. Needing help is not shameful. And your daughter loves you more fiercely than anyone I've ever seen. Lily climbed carefully onto the bed and curled into her mother's side, still crying softly but no longer with fear. Madison stroked her daughter's hair, though her own hands shook from the strain. Andrew watched them, mother and daughter clinging to each other with every ounce of strength they had left, and something inside him settled into a clarity he had not felt in years. He wasn't just intervening out of sympathy or out of a sense of obligation to his past. He was investing his heart into the future of these two people who had suddenly become important to him in ways he couldn't fully explain. When Madison lifted her gaze to him again, eyes shining with gratitude she didn't know how to articulate, he offered a small, steady smile. "We're not going to let anything take Lily away from you," he said. "And we're not going to let this illness take you away from her." For the first time since he had met her, hope flickered in Madison's eyes, not fragile or desperate, but real. And in that moment, Andrew realized that he wasn't simply changing the direction of their lives. They were changing his too. The following weeks unfolded like a long, exhausting battle, one fought not with weapons but with medications, sleepless nights, and a stubborn determination that clung to Madison, Lily, and now Andrew as tightly as cold winter air clung to the windows of the hospital. Madison's treatment began almost immediately after Andrew's intervention, and although his financial support opened doors that had been previously locked, nothing about the medical process itself was easy. The therapy was aggressive, designed for patients whose conditions had progressed too far to respond to traditional methods, and Madison's body reacted with waves of nausea, weakness, and unpredictable spikes of pain. Nurses came in and out with quiet efficiency, adjusting 4 lines, checking vitals, and offering words of encouragement that helped only in the moments they were spoken. Yet despite everything, Madison fought with a tenacity that surprised even the seasoned medical staff. She fought for herself, for her daughter, and for the life she feared slipping away. Lily became a constant presence at her bedside, bringing light into the dim room with crayons, drawings, little handmade cards, and determined optimism. She would climb onto the chair beside her mother each afternoon, kicking her feet softly as she worked on new sketches, snowmen with crooked smiles, Christmas trees covered in colorful shapes, and often the three of them, her mother, herself, and the tall man with brown hair who had stepped into their lives like a character from a storybook. She always drew Andrew smiling, even though in reality his smiles were rare and fleeting, the kind that looked uncertain, as if he was still learning how to make them. Andrew visited nearly every day. He adjusted his schedule without hesitation, canceling meetings, delegating responsibilities, and adapting his life around the needs of this small family he had adopted without officially acknowledging it. In the beginning, he stood awkwardly in the doorway, not wanting to intrude, unsure of how to offer comfort beyond writing checks and signing papers. But the more time he spent in that room, the more natural his presence became. Nurses began greeting him by name. Doctors updated him without needing to be asked. Even other patients in the hallways began recognizing him, the businessman in the immaculate suit who always stopped to talk to a little girl in a yellow dress and red scarf. He brought things with him each day, books for Lily, fruit juice for Madison, new blankets, small toys, warm socks, and once even a tiny artificial Christmas tree decorated with delicate lights that glowed softly in the corner of the room. Lily squealed with delight at that gift, and even Madison, despite her fatigue, smiled with a warmth that made Andrew feel strangely light inside, as though he had done something more meaningful than orchestrating any corporate triumph. But there were difficult days too, days when the treatment hit Madison so hard she could barely stay conscious for more than a few minutes. Lily would sit by the bedside, her small hands gripping her mother's, afraid to move even an inch. Those were the days when Andrew stayed long after visiting hours ended, sometimes pacing the hallway in silent frustration, sometimes sitting beside Lily to provide the steadiness she needed but didn't know how to ask for. He would explain the medical terms the doctors used, translating them into simple, soothing words that made Lily feel less lost. When she asked if her mother was going to die, he didn't offer empty promises. Instead, he told her the truth, that the treatment was difficult but that her mother was fighting, and they would fight with her. One evening, after a particularly grueling treatment session, Madison awoke to find Lily asleep in Andrew's lap. Lily had cried herself into exhaustion earlier, terrified by her mother's weakened breathing, and Andrew had held her, silent and steady, until she finally drifted off. Madison watched them from her bed, tears filling her eyes, not from pain, but from the overwhelming realization that someone who had no obligation to care had become the anchor holding them together. "You don't have to do all this," she whispered when Andrew noticed she was awake. Her voice was weak but earnest. "You've already done more than I ever could have imagined. You have a company to run. A life. We don't want to take that away from you." Andrew looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, one that held both vulnerability and something deeper, something he rarely allowed anyone to see. "You're not taking anything," he said quietly. "You're giving me something." Madison blinked, surprised. "And what is that?" He glanced down at Lily, who had curled into him without fear, her head resting on his chest, her tiny hands gripping the folds of his jacket. When he looked back up, his voice carried a softness she had never heard before. "Purpose," he said. "Real purpose." The room fell silent after that, not with discomfort, but with a fragile understanding that something fundamental had changed between them. Andrew wasn't merely paying bills or filling in an absence, he had become part of their lives in a way none of them had anticipated. As the weeks went on, small signs of improvement began to appear. Madison's appetite returned in small bursts. Her color improved one shade at a time. She laughed occasionally, even if it tired her. Lily noticed everything, celebrating each little victory with renewed excitement. Andrew noticed too, though his reactions were quieter, contained, but no less sincere. The doctors eventually confirmed what all three of them had dared to hope for: the treatment was working. Slowly, painfully, steadily, Madison was responding. The illness that had once been a dark certainty began to loosen its grip. When the doctor delivered the news officially, Lily leapt into Andrew's arms, shouting with joy, while Madison covered her face and sobbed in relief. Andrew stood there holding Lily, watching Madison break into tears of gratitude, and felt something shift in his chest, something he couldn't name but knew he wouldn't forget. For the first time, the future didn't look like a threat. It looked like a promise. Spring arrived quietly, almost shyly, as though it feared disturbing the fragile hope that had settled over Madison's hospital room. The melting snow outside created small rivers along the sidewalks, and the trees budded with the softest shade of green. Inside, the air felt lighter too, less like a battlefield and more like a waiting room for miracles. Madison's recovery progressed slowly at first, but as the weeks passed, her strength returned with remarkable steadiness. She no longer looked like someone disappearing into the sheets, she sat up more often, spoke without losing her breath, and even managed short walks along the hallway with the help of a nurse. Lily celebrated every improvement as if it were the climax of a fairy tale, applauding when her mother managed a full meal, cheering when she walked 5 steps in a row, and hugging her fiercely when a doctor remarked that her test results were the best they had been in months. Her drawings changed too. Where winter pages had been filled with snowmen and shadows, spring drawings now showed bright suns, flowers, and a trio of figures holding hands. Andrew always appeared in these drawings, tall and smiling, standing beside them as though he belonged there as naturally as the sky above their heads. The hospital staff had come to accept Andrew as part of the daily rhythm of the floor. Nurses saved updates for him, doctors presented charts with the assumption he wished to see them, and volunteers greeted him with familiarity. He continued arriving almost every day, sometimes in polished suits straight from business meetings, other times in soft sweaters that made him look far less like the intimidating figure known to the corporate world. He would spend long afternoons sitting near the window with Lily, helping her with math homework, teaching her chess, or listening as she told him elaborate stories about the adventures she imagined having once her mother was home again. It struck him often how much she had grown in just a few months, not in height but in spirit. Her fear had softened into confidence, her loneliness replaced by a deepening trust in the small circle of people who now supported her. Madison watched these interactions with increasing emotion. At first she tried to convince herself that Andrew was simply being kind, but as time went on, she realized his presence was no longer an act of charity, it was a choice. A repeated, unwavering, deeply human choice. He wasn't just funding her recovery, he was becoming a stabilizing force in their lives, someone who offered comfort without asking for anything in return. When he helped Lily with her homework, his voice softened in a way she had never heard from a businessman known for being unyielding in boardrooms. When he sat beside Madison to discuss her progress, he listened carefully, not as a benefactor checking on an investment, but as a man who cared about the outcome. She could see how his expression changed when Lily laughed, how his posture relaxed when she drew him into one of her conversations, how his eyes softened whenever Madison managed even a small smile. One sunny afternoon, weeks into Madison's recovery, the doctor entered the room holding a thick folder. His expression contained the kind of restrained excitement that only experienced physicians could manage. He announced that if Madison continued progressing at her current rate, she might be discharged sooner than projected, perhaps even within 2 weeks. The moment hung in the air as though suspended by invisible threads. Madison covered her mouth, tears filling her eyes. Lily gasped and then launched herself into her mother's arms, careful but overflowing with joy. Andrew remained still for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what he had just heard. The tension he had been carrying in his shoulders since the day he met them began to fade, replaced by a deep sense of relief so powerful it nearly unsteadied him. He stepped closer, resting a supportive hand on the back of Lily's chair, and allowed himself a rare smile, not the polite, restrained kind he gave to investors or journalists, but a genuine expression of happiness that came from deep within. When the doctor left the room, Madison reached out to him with a sincerity that made him pause. "Andrew," she said softly, her voice trembling, "I don't have the words to thank you. Without you, I don't know where we would be." He shook his head, but she gently insisted, "No, please. You need to hear this. You didn't just save my life. You saved Lily's childhood. You gave her back her joy, her hope, her sense of safety. That means more than you can ever imagine." Her words struck him like an unexpected blow, not painful but profoundly disarming. He lowered his gaze for a moment, remembering a much younger version of himself wandering sterile hallways alone, wishing for someone to step in, someone to lift the weight he was too young to carry. When he met Madison's eyes again, there was a quiet vulnerability in his expression. "I didn't do this alone," he said. "You fought. Lily never stopped believing in you. I simply stood where I was needed." But Madison shook her head, smiling softly. "You stood exactly where we would have fallen." Later that evening, Lily insisted they all go to the small courtyard outside the hospital, where flowers were beginning to bloom. It was the first time Madison had been outdoors in months. Andrew walked slowly beside her, offering his arm for support, though she tried to hide how grateful she was for the gesture. Lily ran ahead to inspect every flower bed, pointing out the ones she thought were the prettiest. Madison inhaled the fresh air deeply, closing her eyes as sunlight warmed her face. Andrew watched her with a quiet admiration he didn't attempt to disguise. For a moment, the three of them simply existed together, connected not by obligation but by everything they had endured. The weight of fear had lifted, replaced by something that felt like the beginning of a new chapter. Madison's health was returning. Lily's smile had never been brighter. And Andrew, who had once believed his heart too guarded to let anyone in, found himself wanting to stay close, wanting to protect them, wanting to be part of whatever came next. As Lily came running back, clutching a tiny flower she had plucked despite the posted rules, she pressed it into Andrew's hand with a grin. "This is for you," she declared. "For being our hero." Andrew looked at the small flower, then at Madison and Lily standing beside him, and realized that heroism had nothing to do with money or power. It had to do with moments like this, moments where love, gratitude, and hope intertwined so tightly that they formed something new, something whole, something worth holding on to. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a man observing a family from afar. He felt like someone who belonged. Spring settled fully into summer by the time Madison was discharged from the hospital, and the day she walked out of the main entrance without assistance felt like sunlight breaking through after a long, relentless storm. Lily practically bounced beside her, one hand gripping her mother's, the other swinging wildly with excitement. Andrew stayed a step behind them, not wanting to overshadow the moment but unable to hide how deeply proud he felt. Madison still moved slowly, her strength not fully restored, yet there was a new steadiness in her posture, a confidence that came not just from medication or medical victories but from knowing she no longer faced her battles alone. The breeze carried the scent of budding flowers and freshly cut grass, a reminder that the world had kept turning even during the darkest months, waiting patiently for them to return to it. The first weeks at home were a blend of joy and adjustment. Their apartment, once quiet with worry, now buzzed with life. Lily filled every corner with laughter, stories, and drawings that decorated the fridge and walls. She insisted on cooking special meals for her mother, which usually meant buttered noodles or toast cut into funny shapes. Madison moved through her home with gratitude in every step, lingering on small moments she once feared she'd never experience again, waking up in her own bed, sitting at the kitchen table with her daughter, stepping out onto the balcony to feel sunlight on her skin. There were still doctor visits, medication schedules, and days when exhaustion forced her to rest, but each challenge felt manageable, softened by hope. And Andrew remained a constant presence. He visited often, always knocking quietly and stepping inside with the same gentle consideration he had shown in the hospital. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes books for Lily, and sometimes nothing at all, just himself, which seemed to be what Lily and Madison cherished most. He helped with errands, checked on Madison's health, and played board games with Lily, who had decided he was unbeatable at Connect 4 but terrible at drawing animals, a flaw she teased him about without mercy. He seemed more relaxed in their small, warm apartment than in any boardroom, as if the corporate armor he wore for the world loosened when he crossed their threshold. One evening, as summer sunlight filtered through the windows, Lily burst into the living room carrying a small wrapped box decorated with a slightly crooked bow she'd tied herself. "You have to open it now," she insisted, pushing it into Andrew's hands with an excitement so intense she couldn't stand still. Madison watched from the sofa, smiling softly, her eyes glowing with something deeper than simple gratitude. Andrew unwrapped the box slowly, more touched by Lily's enthusiasm than he expected. Inside lay a delicate keychain, a small cookie charm shaped like a heart, painted in warm golden colors. It was simple, inexpensive, and yet somehow more meaningful than any luxury item he had ever owned. Lily beamed at him, her blue eyes shining. "It's a thank you gift," she explained. "It's for everything you did. You helped Mommy get better. You helped me not be scared anymore. And I wanted you to have something so you'd remember us even when you're busy." Andrew's throat tightened unexpectedly, and he had to look down to steady his expression. "Lily," he said quietly, "I could never forget you. Or your mother." His voice softened even further. "This means more to me than you know." Madison rose from the sofa and approached him slowly. There was a warmth in her eyes, but also a vulnerability, a recognition that the man standing before her had become someone irreplaceable, someone who had stepped into the darkest chapter of their lives and illuminated it with compassion, loyalty, and strength. "You gave us back our life," she said gently. "You didn't have to. But you did. And we won't ever stop being grateful." Andrew met her gaze, and for a moment the world felt still, as though everything around them, every sound, every movement, paused to acknowledge the quiet bond forming between them. He didn't respond immediately, because the words he felt were too heavy, too raw, too honest to be spoken without thought. Instead, he placed the keychain carefully in his pocket and offered a small, sincere smile. As summer shifted toward autumn, the three of them spent more and more time together. They attended Lily's school events, went to the park on weekends, shared meals, and slowly built a rhythm that felt natural and effortless, as though they had been moving toward this connection long before the night in the cafe. Lily began introducing Andrew as part of her family, and he didn't correct her. Madison found herself laughing more than she had in years, and when Andrew looked at her with a mixture of admiration and gentleness, she no longer turned away. Though none of them said it out loud, they understood, this wasn't temporary. This wasn't charity or obligation or coincidence. It was something real, something steady, something shaped by hardship and held together by mutual care. One crisp evening, as the first leaves began to fall, they walked together down the street toward the small park near their home. Lily skipped ahead, chasing shadows, her laughter dancing through the air. Andrew and Madison followed side by side, their hands brushing now and then before gently intertwining. Neither of them pulled away. Madison looked up at the sky, then at Andrew, and said quietly, "I never thought life could feel this full again." Andrew squeezed her hand. "I never thought I could feel this connected to anyone again," he admitted. "But you and Lily, you changed everything." They continued walking, the fading light casting warm hues across their faces. Lily turned back and called to them, her voice bright and full of joy. "Hurry up. You're too slow." Madison laughed. Andrew smiled. And together, they followed the little girl who had brought them into each other's lives. The world had once seemed fragile, uncertain, and frightening. Now, it felt like a beginning. A beginning none of them ever expected, but one they were ready to embrace, together.